And Mara Lee, what a pleasure it is to welcome you. We've had a chance to speak a bit earlier this year, and my gosh, discovering you is one of the high points of the year. So wonderful to have you with us. Many of those of you who have tuned in are concerned with campus anti-Semitism. How can we not be these days, given everything that's been going on campuses? Mara Lee is at the moment not on the campus. She works for Hillel International, but in fact, she had been a tenured faculty member at one of the branches of California State University, and putting up with a lot of stuff that was not easy. She decided, at least for now, to set that aside and move away from campus life, although her job with Hillel International as Director of Content Development for the campus climate, of course, has her closely connected to developments on campuses. Mara Lee is a very creative person. And most of all, as a writer, she did an MFA in creative writing. And among other things, she's a poet. But beyond that, she went on to do a PhD from Columbia University. To her credit, she's the author or editor of some 5 books, 2 of which came out this past year. One of them is entitled Antisemitism and the White Supremacist Imaginary. I'm sure that she'll be drawing on material she learned in writing that book in today's talk. She also co-edited a book called Challenging Antisemitism, Lessons from the Literacy Classrooms. Mara Lee, we look forward to hearing from you, learning from you, engaging you after your talk in an interesting discussion of all the issues. I'm now going to turn over to you and look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to talk with everyone today. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to start by sharing an observation, something you may have noticed as well. A lot of people seem very interested in the racial character of Jewish people, specifically whether or not Jews are white. So I'm going to try to share my screen right now. Here's a very small sampling of headlines from newspaper and magazine articles and blogs and educational videos on the topic. Are Jews white? Are Jews a race? Are Jews white? Are Jews white? Are Jews white? From reporters at The Atlantic and Jewish journalists to content creators on YouTube and bloggers of various political leanings, we hear some variation of this question. Sometimes the inquiries are more specific, concerned with the racial identity and potential whiteness of Ashkenazi Jews only. Sometimes the question is about American Jews in particular, though I would argue that the question is usually about American Jews, even if the American part goes unstated. While authors may admit that the matter of Jewish racialization is complicated, most do attempt to provide answers. Some suggest that Jews once weren't white, but now they are, whereas still others claim that Jews used to be white, but are no longer. Some suggest that the answer varies because Jewish isn't a race. Instead, it's a religion or ethnicity or an ethno-religion. Yet, people seem to be really, really interested in the racial character of Jews, even those who claim that Jews don't have one because Jewishness isn't a race. So if the internal logic of this statement doesn't make sense, it's probably because there's some other logic operating here in some other way. When I talk about racialization, I'm talking about the process by which a community and its members are categorized according to supposedly hereditary biological traits. Racialization suggests that a group of people are by nature different, and often, but not always, attempts to identify that difference through supposed phenotypical characteristics. So you might have noticed I've used the term supposed a couple of times. That's because though peoples with similar ancestry may share some genetic characteristics, race is not real in the biological sense of the term. Right? Race is a social construct, not a biological reality, despite its tangible real-world implications. Excuse me. One of the ways we know this is that who and what is considered a race changes over time and varies across geographical spaces. Racialization does not only impact those who are legally classified as members of a racial group. Ethno-religious groups like Jews, as well as Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and to some scholars, the Amish, are frequently racialized. And racialization as a process is not necessarily accurate, right? Because it comes from outside of the community. For example, research shows that Sikh men are often racialized as Muslim and subjected to Islamophobic sentiment, and that people who are presumed to be Jewish but who are not are in fact subjected to anti-Semitism. But the process of racialization doesn't require accuracy. It only requires categorization. If I can be facetious, I would just say we like categories, right? We especially like categories that are easy to understand, even if that ease of understanding requires reducing and obscuring complexity. The binary of black and white that prevails in the US provides an easy schema for understanding race. And while there have been efforts to nuance this binary, we still tend toward binaries, albeit slightly more expansive ones, such as white and non-white. Racialization is part and parcel of racism, for it is the process of categorization that justifies discrimination against a particular group. Racial anti-Semitism suggests that Jews ought to be disliked or discriminated against, not because they worship differently, but because they are different. Racial anti-Semitism says, for example, that Jews are by nature cheap or manipulative. Those deeply embedded stereotypes aren't comments on Jewish work ethic or cultural norms. They're evidence of the racialized belief that Jews are intrinsically different from non-Jews. When American pseudo-scholars of the 19th century measured Jewish people's heads to determine where Jews fit in the black-white schema, that was racialization. But it was also racialization that motivated them to measure Jews' heads in the first place. For many Americans today, particularly left-leaning academics, contemporary understandings of racism are closely linked to appearance and color, meaning that for anti-Semitism to be understood as racial, Jews must also be seen to look different. So as you can tell from the headlines that I just shared with you, right, the question about Jews' character, Jews' racial character, generally relates specifically to the presumption or perhaps the precarity of Jewish whiteness. In the United States, whiteness, or at least light skin, has been understood by scholars of race and racism as the invisible default from which racialized minorities are distinguished. And I want to clarify that when I speak of Jews this way, and indeed this is the way I believe that the authors of these articles and blogs on Jewish whiteness speak of Jews, it's not the bodies of real Jewish people I'm referring to, but instead the concept of Jews in the social imaginary. Right? It is the concept of the Jew, the mythology of the Jew, the essentialized monolithic category of the Jew, accurate or not, that we call up when we speak about how we do or ought to categorize Jewish people. By virtue of even speaking this way of Jews, we begin a process of racialization. Phenotypically, actual Jews, not the concept, but the human beings, differ widely, both in the US and around the world. In the US specifically, approximately 15% of Jews identify as or would be identified in the US framing as people of color. If we go by skin color, Jews from Ethiopia and India would likely not be considered white here in the US, nor would nearly half of Jews in Israel, regardless of the fact that some people frame Israel as a white colonial power. Yet we have a particular idea of American Jews, one that stems as much from anti-Semitism as it does from historical patterns of Jewish immigration to the US. If asked to picture a Jew, chances are a lot of folks will conjure a similar set of images, drawn more from a persistent racialized stereotype than the diverse population of Jews in the United States or around the world. Even in colonial America, the notion of whiteness since then has been inextricably linked to a European Christian identity. Before the primary racial terms were Black and white, the terms of choice were Christian and heathen. Interestingly, however, Jews of the time were neither. In the 1669 South Carolina Colony Charter, for example, religious freedom was ostensibly granted to Jews, heathens, and dissenters alike. So what is notable here is that even when Jews experienced affordances like citizenship, they were even then positioned outside the categories with which race was being defined. At the same time, Jews were also categorized and treated as a separate group and subjected to racialized social discrimination. In other words, Jews had some of the legal rights only afforded to white people, known then as Christians. They were racialized as non-Christian, and they were labeled outside of the existing racial binary. This history, in part, explains why even some race and whiteness scholars have called Jews near white or not quite white. While we've settled since into a framing of race as Black and white, whiteness as a construct denotes not only light skin, but also what Tanisha Tevis, Naomi Nishi, and I have called the, quotes, set of shared beliefs, values, behaviors, language, and convictions based on hegemonic ideologies that contribute to and underscore the racial identity development of white people and those in proximity to being white, end quote. So that proximity piece is important. For a book project a few years ago, I interviewed light-skinned Jewish educators about their experiences being Jewish in academia. Unsurprisingly, we talked a lot about race and feelings of difference and exclusion. Many participants told me that they understood their identities as distinct from the norms of whiteness. Some participants said they knew they looked Jewish or had been told they looked Jewish, whereas others talked about how they could pass as white. One participant said being Jewish was like being in a, quote, little floating box where we don't belong anywhere except to ourselves. We're in the not white box, but we're not in the Black, Indigenous, people of color box, and there's no other box, end quote. Another said, quote, I am white until they know I'm Jewish, end quote. So for all of these reasons, I am far less interested in coming to an answer about the racial nature of Jewishness than I am in examining why people keep asking the question and what they think might be gained by finding an answer. So the lived experiences of Jews aren't really represented in popular or academic discourses of race. And I want to emphasize how, from one perspective, albeit maybe a cynical one, it's remarkably silly. It's remarkably silly that so many scholars today cannot or will not admit the limitations of these intellectual frameworks, right? The idea of a framework is just that, a framework to be built upon and possibly repaired and rebuilt as needed to help us better understand the world. But entire worldviews are already built on these frameworks. Worldviews the scholars and certainly the activists who use them might be resistant to topple. So perhaps it is not actually cynical then to posit that the reason these frameworks don't fully account for the experiences of Jews is that they don't account for Jews as people. Racism and racial anti-Semitism rest upon dehumanization, and racialization leads to dehumanization. The social and intellectual climate we currently operate in encourages people to retreat into identity groups, often for legitimate and relatable reasons like community and survival. But in that climate, it doesn't surprise me that Jews, a people whose history includes repeated and consistent dehumanization, aren't conceptualized by many other members of society as a people with an identity at all. Instead, attempts are made to fit Jews into existing categories that don't fully account for them. That's racialization, as well as politicization. And since we know that anti-Semitism exists across the political spectrum, what is particularly intriguing about all of this questioning is that people on the most extreme ends of the spectrum tend to be fairly certain of American Jews' racial character. The far-right anti-Semite, the white supremacist, is certain that the Jew is not white, the same way that the far-left anti-Semite, who may be unaware of or unwilling to acknowledge that their views are indeed anti-Semitic, is certain that the Jew is white. On the far right, the suggestion that Jews are white poses a threat to whiteness itself. On the far left, the suggestion that Jews, or at least Jews with light skin, aren't white is seen as the denial of privilege. But the process of racialization, as well as the motives behind it and its outcomes, are awfully similar on both ends of the spectrum. While the white supremacist ascribes a non-white racial character to Jews in order to justify anti-Semitism, on the far left, the presumption of Jewish whiteness minimizes or obscures anti-Semitism, which in turn enables anti-Semitism. All of this is to say that understanding how Jews are racialized helps us understand anti-Semitism today. Students and educators I have interviewed described being called kike and having things thrown at them when they were wearing clothing or jewelry that marked them as Jewish. Jews have been questioned on contemporary American college campuses about their horns. There have been countless comments about noses. Personally, even at times when I wasn't wearing a Jewish star and therefore could not be identified as Jewish by my jewelry, I've been called a hook-nosed bitch, a hook-nosed Jew bitch, and subjected to other anti-Semitic comments about my nose by strangers. That's all racialization. It doesn't matter that there are also Black Jews, Latinx Jews, Asian Jews, Indian Jews, and light-skinned Jews with smaller noses than mine. Right? The stereotype embedded in the anti-Semitic imaginary views my nose as Jewish and therefore racializes me as the same. And yet, skin color remains the defining marker of minoritization and marginalization, including or perhaps especially in academia. Jews are a tiny minority in the world and in the US. Many educational initiatives ostensibly designed to support racial and ethnic minorities are specifically geared toward minorities identified as underrepresented. Jews, however, are either perceived as or are statistically overrepresented in higher education, a framing similar to the anti-Semitic logic used to justify enrollment quotas from the 1920s to as recent as the 1960s. Beginning about a century ago, one of the methods used to exclude Jewish students from elite colleges was to request applicants submit a photograph so admissions officers and committees could determine the applicant's racial character. Today, because Jews are still seen as overrepresented in higher education, either because of their Jewishness or because of how representation is defined and determined, Jewish students are not given access to the opportunities afforded to underrepresented minorities, regardless of their own minority status, experiences of marginalization, or economic need. Broadly, we see that Jewish racialization as white today serves the same aims of exclusion and marginalization that racialization as Jewish once served. It is also not solely, but at least in part, the presumption of Jewish whiteness that allows for Jews to be excluded from initiatives designed to remedy various forms of discrimination and bigotry. Year after year, Jews are the targets of the majority of hate crimes directed at a religious group and are seen as a non-white race by white nationalists who publicly declare their intent to eradicate peoples of non-white races. Yet in the context of cross-racial solidarity, Jews often are seen not as a minority, but as either white or more often as representatives of white supremacy. Perhaps in no context has this paradoxical dynamic played out more clearly than on college campuses since October 7th. Visibly Jewish students, identified by clothing or by phenotypical features, have been violently attacked by fellow students and outside activists on college campuses across the country. Jewish students are being attacked more frequently on campus now, but the American Jews most likely to be targeted have always been those whose appearance announces them as Jewish. Some students intentionally take off their yarmulkes or Jewish stars, or have been warned by their parents to do so, to minimize the extent to which they can be marked as Jewish by appearance, the extent to which they can be racialized. Though the frequency with which Jewish students do this has increased since October 7th, the negotiation of what to show and what to hide is also not a new phenomenon. And it's no wonder that Jews fear being identified as such on campus. We've seen Houthi flags that read "Death to the Jews" on college campuses, and protesters echo the sentiments of a genocidal terrorist organization whose charter explicitly declares their goal to kill Jews. On the same college campuses, other students, as well as faculty members and entire academic departments, have publicly equated both Israel and Zionism with racism and white supremacy. So in other words, while Jewish students are racialized as Jewish and excluded from campus life because they are Jewish, Israel, the only Jewish nation in the world, is demonized as a white supremacist settler colonial state. And Zionism, a complex Jewish ideology, or perhaps more accurately, a collection of Jewish philosophies and ideologies, is maligned as a white supremacist settler colonial political system. And again, from one perspective, it makes no sense. From another, it makes perfect sense. Right? Years before October 7th, Jewish students were removed from or pushed out of social organizations and student government positions at multiple American universities after being labeled Zionist, which they were told made them racist. In 2018, pro-Palestine activists declared their mission to, quote, make being Zionist uncomfortable on the NYU campus, for example, end quote. End quote, for example. The mission, activists clarified, wasn't against Judaism, but against racism. In 2021, a student senator at USC posted on social media that she wanted to kill Zionists. In a context where Israel and Zionism have already been conflated with whiteness, colonialism, and racism, Jews, all Jews, are seen as oppressors, despite their minoritization or the prevalence of anti-Semitism, or the irony that all of these conflations are themselves arguably anti-Semitic, or at best, evidence of limited critical thinking. Once Jews are fetishized as white settlers, anti-Semitism can be justified by the anti-Semite as something they have brought upon themselves. Classic victim blaming, yes, but when the victim is seen as white, it operates a little differently because whiteness is associated with power in the United States. The thing is, even when Jews are seen as white, they're also seen as separate from white. Some non-Jewish people may see Jews as white foremost because they don't know enough Jews to know one who isn't, who doesn't appear white to them, or because of the utter lack of education about Jews in American schools. But more insidiously, that presumption of Jewish whiteness combines with long-standing anti-Semitic myths about wealth, power, and privilege. Jews then become what Melanie K. Kantrowitz called super white, or what Pamela Paretsky called hyper white, or what I have called the worst of what whiteness is and does. Racializing Jews as white allows for the perpetuation and justification of racial anti-Semitism, even if it would seem to do the opposite. So I'll share one more example. I'd imagine many of you remember the incident in April at the home of Erwin Chemerinsky, the Jewish dean of the UC Berkeley School of Law. Though Chemerinsky has rarely spoken about Israel, he became the subject of an anti-Semitic propaganda campaign that labeled him a Zionist and accused him of murdering Palestinian children. Shortly after this blood libel, activists disrupted a dinner at his home. When the protesters refused to leave the private property despite numerous requests, his wife, also a professor, attempted to grab a microphone from a protester's hand. The incident was recorded and posted to social media, where these professors were labeled violent white supremacists with fancy degrees and accused of assault on a Muslim protester. I'm going to share another couple of images here. Right, so we see this declared as racist behavior from Chemerinsky and his wife. We see Fisk, his wife, the professor, accused of assaulting a Muslim hijabi law student. So we see also the racialization of the other people involved in the exchange to different ends. While most of the media discourse after the event was about the legality of the protest and response, I was most interested in this dynamic of racialization that played out as scholars and activists attempted to make meaning of the event through frameworks more familiar and more useful to them. Self-declared anti-racist activists ignored that the protester had occupied the private property of a Jewish man she had targeted and essentialized because he was Jewish. Instead, they positioned the perpetrator as a racialized and gendered victim, and the victim as a white supremacist. Through a worldview that sees light skin as the mark of an oppressor, a brown-skinned student is far more easily seen as the victim than a light-skinned professor, even when that student is legally and ethically in the wrong. Moreover, the labels and accusations levied against Chemerinsky aren't just misguided, reductive attempts to intellectualize a complex situation, though they are indeed misguided and reductive. The student and faculty activist groups also called for both professors to be fired. So first, these activists distributed racialized anti-Jewish posters. Then they protested at his house. Until this point, he was being racialized as Jewish. Then, when they were forced to leave, they called him a white supremacist and demanded he be fired. Ultimately, this Jewish man's racialization as white served as a strategy by which anti-Semitism, racialized Jew hatred against him, could be both justified and perpetuated. And this shift from racializing social propaganda to attempted economic discrimination, right, the calls for him to be fired, can be seen in other professional arenas as well. Since October 7th, publishing houses, literary journals have posted warnings on their submission pages that they do not publish work by Zionists. Jewish authors accused of being Zionist have seen their books blacklisted from bookstores. Art museums have relocated or modified exhibits accused of sharing Zionist perspectives. The term Zionist has historically operated as metonymic code for Jew, and regardless of some activist attempts to theoretically sever anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism, it operates similarly today, both rhetorically and politically. But it does so under the cover of white racialization, which in a society struggling to recognize its relationship to white supremacy, as the US continues to struggle to do, it makes it far more difficult to recognize. So before I close and we move to questions, I want to show one more slide. I spoke earlier about the politicization involved with racialized anti-Semitism. The students, the protesters, the so-called anti-racists who perpetuate this sort of anti-Semitism from the left often believe themselves to be progressive. But if you're curious, here's what the white supremacists on the other end of the political spectrum have to say about all of it. Lucas Gage is a former chairman of a neo-Nazi white nationalist group who apparently is famous on social media for threatening Jews. Since October 7th, he and other white supremacists have positioned Jews as super whites, right? Displacement for their own white supremacy. Presumably in response to efforts to legislate anti-Semitic violence, he said, quote, "It is now illegal to hurt Jews' feelings. I hope the left and POC, people of color, see who the real white devil is now," end quote. So in order for the unlikely bedfellows we're seeing, right, Islamist anti-Semites, white nationalists, and students convinced they're working for social justice to occupy that bed together, right? Jews have to be seen as both the epitome of whiteness and as something worse than white, Jewish. Or do I mean Zionist? Thank you.